the round brush. It's so round. Yeah. You might have heard you should learn to use the round brush when you digitally paint because it's the foundation of digital painting. But chances are, if you want to streamline your process and get maybe that more gritty feeling rather than the completely digital experience, then you want to create something that's a little more customized and ideally tailored to your needs. So today we're gonna go over all of the customization options for brushes in Clip Studio so that by the end of the video, you'll be able to create something that's really tailored to your needs. Oh, and if you really don't want to do that, or if you can't get something that you actually like, I will put a link in the video description with my brush packs for Clip Studio that you can download from Gumroad and save yourself a bunch of time. Okay, let's go. All right, so here we are. Hard round, yeah. Well, this one is actually slightly more advanced already because it's got some pressure sensitivity. So if I disable that, this is probably what you get for a hard round brush. And by default in Clip Studio, you will notice now that my interface is a little bit different. Like this panel here is usually on this side. It's docked as well as this subtool panel. This is your brush list. I usually keep them arranged in one window because I don't like to switch, between these. But the default brushes in Clip Studio are going to be in these sub panels here. So you can take any of these and then click here to create a copy of the brush. And it's going to be hard round 3. You can choose tool icon. This doesn't really matter. You can choose whatever you want. So I'm going to have this hard round 3 here, and it's basically the same. If you want to start editing a brush, you're going to have to click this little wrench icon here, and it's going to pop up subtool detail. Again, this menu here, this panel is probably going to be on this side on your Clip Studio, depending on whether or not you have rearranged your interface. But hey, let's start with something simple. So in the brush size, well, you already saw it there, but you can set up the pen pressure sensitivity. Basically, if you press a lot, you get the full size of the brush. You press just a little, it tapers away. As simple as it is. And this little eye here is what is used to show the option there. So you can see that if it's something that you plan on changing as you paint, by all means, have it there. Otherwise, it's really not necessary. Other options for pretty much every single parameter in Clip Studio are tilt. So depending on how much you tilt, let me disable the pen pressure. How much you tilt the pen, you cannot see this obviously because you cannot see my hand, but I am tilting this. I'm using a Wacom Cintiq 16, so if your pen does not support tilt, then you're not going to get this effect. But I'm tilting the pen up and down. So if it's like very straight, it's going to do, very like perpendicular to the surface, it's going to do something like this, like a thinner line. Otherwise, on the side, it's going to be thicker. So kind of like you are shading with a pencil on the side, one of those long charcoal pencils. Hopefully you do. Use charcoal sometimes. It's fun. Anyway, tilt, that's what it does. These sliders, in this case, you got minimum and maximum. The pen pressure only has the minimum. So if it's set to minimum, if I press barely, I can get a very thin line. Let me increase the brush size. So you see, very thin, depending on how sensitive your pen is. And if I push, I get it thicker. So if you don't want to go very, very small, and there is at least 1 pixel size here to tick if you don't want to go sub-pixel for these minimal sizes. See, this is what you get for a not 0 minimum value. Velocity is how fast you move, basically. So you move faster, it gets narrower. Actually, if you move really fast, it basically disappears. Let's see if I do at least 1 pixel. Yeah, at least 1 pixel keeps that, you see, keeps that connected, even if it goes below the 1 pixel or 0 basically at that point. And the random is what it is. So it's random, literally. Like every blot is going to be a different size. And you can change, again here, the minimum value. Could be 100, could be 0. You can kind of get this sort of slightly more organic already effect with this, which is fairly nice. Specify size on screen. It basically means that, as far as I can understand it, let me disable that first. So this is the size I paint at, and it's going to stay the same size regardless of the size of the canvas. So it's just gonna keep the size of the brush compared to the size of your screen, okay? Not very useful. I never use it, honestly. So there is that. That's for brush size. I'm gonna maybe leave the pen pressure. No, let's see it later. Ink. This is what you use to blend things together and also change opacity. Now, I'm not a fan of this opacity setting. So you can change how opaque your brush is. So if you paint over, it's going to be kind of like that, very, very digital. You have the same settings, obviously, that you would have for the pen size or the brush size. But I would rather have you use another setting that's density rather than opacity, because opacity, it's very digital. I don't know. I don't really like it that much. See, this is what you get with opacity. It's not great. So I tend not to use this, and instead I'm going to show you another option that's better in my opinion. Blending mode is exactly the same as the blending mode from the layers that's here, except it's going to blend each stroke. So if you set, say, was it color burn or linear burn? I think it was linear burn. Yeah. So it changes. See, it's probably faint. So if I decrease opacity like that, see how much darker it gets? Much more than it normally would if I were to disable that. So say normal, say it's just a little bit like that. With linear burn, it gets much, much darker, much faster. So it's basically how each stroke blends with the same layer. So you can have different effects, like if I select that glow, see, it's doing that. We choose something brighter, see. That's just adding things on the same layer. So it's not going to affect the other layers. This is only going to be on the same layer. I tend not to use much of that apart from the linear burn a little bit. If you want to create something that's like a real pen, like a ballpoint pen, this is probably it. This is what you want to use because it gets kind of inkier and darker as you paint or draw. So I kind of like it for that. Just for this. Anything else I tend not to use. Color mixing is self-explanatory, so it's going to mix the colors. So if I have this color here, I get another one, and then it's going to start mixing it. Okay, as soon as I paint in it, I can color dab. Now, the amount of paint can be changed, so depending on how much you put in, the color you pick is going to overpower whatever is on screen. So this is not mixing much, but if I reduce the amount of paint, see, it's basically nothing. Like it should be, right? It's here. But if I go into that, it's not going to do it. It's going to be overpowered by what's already there, right? Because the amount of paint is not much. Density, pretty much the same. Doesn't change much. It's all going to affect how it looks and how much it blends, basically. This probably works better, again, in conjunction with the other density setting, not opacity. You can use opacity too. Like you can still create some decent effects like this. But I would not do it personally. I kind of like the thicker paint. If I use color mixing, I tend to use thicker paint, something like that. Color stretch, again, it's how much it steers towards that final color, how little or how much it does. There you go, something like that. You're gonna have to play around and see what works best for you, because I can tell you, hey, use this or that, and you can grab my brushes. I do have a pastel brush that I made for that, but you're probably not gonna like that. If I will be honest, you should really make your own brushes. It's not a joke. Make your own brushes. The new perceptual mode is actually probably better, although a little slower, as you can see. For that, see, it's kind of lagging. Again, you're gonna have to experiment. I don't even remember which one is the new one now. It should be the perceptual. Standard should be the old one, but they keep changing the options and how they're arranged, so that might be the opposite. I think perceptual is the one that's newer. So you get slightly more true to what it really is. See, if I keep dabbing, dab, that's what you get. And then it goes away, obviously, again, because there's nothing here. So it's pretty cool. Anything else, even these like color mixing, like running out of color type of things, they're okay settings. I have not seen them do anything good for my personal needs. So play around with them. Make your own stuff. Obviously, blending mode is disabled with color mixing because that would create probably more lag or more of a messy thing. If you use color mixing, in my opinion, it's better if you use like thicker paint. You can couple it with some other settings that we're going to see, especially the brush tip. That's going to give slightly more punch to this. But other than that, I would highly recommend using just opaque paint like that. Let's go to, well, color jitter is pretty much useless. It's just going to change the the color of the tip. Again, unless you want to do something like this, like really wild, you can add just a little variety if you want to each stroke. Let me remove this mess. So you see it's changing just a little bit. This might even be a little too much. So if you want just a little bit of variety like that, you can have it. Not sure how much it helps. No, honestly. Yeah, I'm not sure you want to do this, quite frankly. Okay, it's not the greatest. It's still linear burn. So as you can see, linear burn keeps affecting that even if it's opaque paint. So again, not very useful, color jitter, unless you want to create some variety and you're not able to do it by color picking like this. Because usually I would disable this and I would do that. If I want to introduce some random colors, I would turn on the density setting, do some random stuff like this. Maybe 5, 6 colors, and then I would pick from those, and then I would mix those. That would probably be better, at least for me, less of a digital experience. Although you could argue that the color or the pigment is slightly different in real paint, like each little bit of pigment is different from the one next to it, but it's arguable. Randomize per stroke, this is not going to change immediately, but it's going to change every time you put down a color. Again, you can try that. It's more, this is slightly better in my opinion compared to the other. So see, slightly better, probably a little better. You might have a use for this. I tend not to, but this is slightly better, especially if you're doing grass or stuff like that. This might be actually useful. I don't do as many backgrounds, so I don't use it as much. And you can change the main color or subcolor depending on the type of colors that you are using. Anti-aliasing, I tend to keep this to the maximum setting. This is no anti-aliasing at all, so if I zoom in. Jagged edges, non-jagged. As simple as that. Brush shape, this is only used, as far as I can tell, for the visuals here. So you can change it if you want. I tend to leave it as it is. Brush tip is my favorite setting though. Brush tip literally tells the system what every single dot that you put down, because this is basically, the stroke you see is basically a sequence of dots, what it has to look like. So in this case, it's a circle. It's a simple circle, right? It's a round brush, so it's, well, round. But you can change a lot of things just for the circle itself. So for example, I can make it soft. That's how you get a soft brush. Obviously, various degrees of softness, right? This is, I guess, my favorite. I tend not to use the 100% thick brush, especially if I have a different tip, which we'll see in a second with material. So see what you like. Thickness just changes how wide it is, basically, like that. You can get a very interesting calligraphic effect like this. See, if you change the angle here, now you get yourself a calligraphic brush. And you can change the orientation vertical or horizontal. This setting also has some dynamics, so you can change it with the direction of the pen. So as I turn my pen, this follows it, right? Instead of being completely static. So look, if I disable, see, if I disable it, it stays the same. If I turn on, it follows the angle of my pen, even if I stretch my arm a little. Pen tilt, same thing as before. So if your pen supports tilt, it's going to change. I'm not going to see it much here, probably. Direction of the line is where you're pulling. See? It doesn't really matter how I turn my pen. It just follows like a snake, like that. This is also very useful. Okay, pretty interesting. You can just do strokes like that and then change them depending on the angle at which you draw. Random is random. So this is probably useless like this with a circle. You can get this sort of fuzzy effect if you like it. But it's going to be very useful for material, especially if you're going to do clouds or stuff like that. Brush density. This is my favorite setting. So you can adjust the density by gap. Density is similar to opacity, except it's more organic, I guess. You see how much more organic this is compared, look at that, compared to opacity. Opacity affects the whole thing. I don't know how to express it. It's like it affects the whole opacity of the thing. But density is different. Density is way, you can use both. But density, I feel, is way more it's kind of like flow in Photoshop. It's more organic. If you go low with density, very, very low like that, you can get this really nice effect. I don't know, I tend to prefer it. It's similar to opacity, but not quite the same. So I tend to use this. Again, it feels more organic. You can use both. So if you go to ink again, you turn on this, now you got both. So if you fancy both, use both. I tend, again, not to use both, just density, but you're free to use both if you like. And density by gap is basically how far away, it's going to adjust the density depending on how far away the strokes are. So this is what I use. It's basically my triangle brush. It's just got a triangular tip, but it's pretty much the same. You know, the one I use for sketching is pretty much this one. So going to be very, it's very pencil-like for me. It's still digital-ish feeling. I got used to this, and then I couldn't go back. So, material, very important aspect of this panel. You can change the tip of the brush with anything else, any material you've added. And I've added a few. I'm probably going to get something random here, not flowers, definitely. You can get, oh, there it is. That's my triangle brush. Oh, go back. So this is my triangle brush. It changes literally the shape of the brush. Now, it's going to look random because it is random. If I go back here, I remove random, so it's going to be always in the same direction. I tend to keep it either as a direction of the pen or direction of the line, either or. This is going to depend on what you like, obviously. So this is, I think, is the shape I use. This or something that's a little more gritty, but it's pretty similar to what I use for sketching. Like this is literally the same shape I have for the other brush. So it's pretty good. And it's not difficult to make. I'm going to show you how to make it. Actually, I'm going to show you how to make it now. So before I do that, though, you notice, again, the randomness thing. Notice how it's changing the orientation of that shape with every blot it puts down, okay? So this is extremely useful if I disable the density thing. It's extremely, sorry, also the opacity. Extremely useful to make something like an inking brush. Very useful. Look at how much more, if I turn on this, look at how much more organic this looks already. This is not a good shape for that, okay? Not very good. But I can change it by also editing the thickness like that. Look at how much more interesting of a mark that is. And you can use anything else. Let's actually make one. Let's make a blot. So I'm going to make a new document. There we go. And I'm going to make a blot, basically. I'm going to use this brush to make a blot. So let's make something random with some random crap in it. So we make a blot of some kind. Okay, let's pretend this is our brush. Then I'm going to make sure I convert this to grayscale layer. Otherwise, it's not going to accept the color of whatever we put in, whatever we select here. If we leave this to a color layer, it's going to retain the color we chose here. Blender mode is going to be normal, so just grayscale. Then I'm going to go to edit. Probably want to select it also, maybe. I'm not sure. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Register material, image, and I'm going to call it my blot. Use for brush tip. This is really important. Use it for brush tip. And I'm going to save it in image material brush. Okay, go back. I'm going to go to materials here. Call it my blot, right? There you go. That's it. That's our blot brush. Obviously, it is a little fuzzy because I use a fuzzy contour. But we can change that. Like if I go here, invert the selection and remove that, I can use this shape too. Edit, register material, image, use for brush tip, and brush here. A brush, tip, and select. Here's this one, right? There you go. See? And I'm not going to adjust density by gap. This is basically an inking brush. Okay. You can change the spacing of these dots here. This one is pretty good. I kind of like that. Look at how much more inky it is. You can drop down here and say fixed, so you can choose the gap. Bigger gap obviously is farther blot. See, that's exactly what it is. Closer, something like that. We can also put more materials. We can literally mix the tips with other stuff. Let's see what happens with this. So it tries to basically use both alternatively, and we can also have them repeat in a specific quantity or order. If we go to stroke and change the repeat method, this is going to give you the amount of repetition. These settings, repeat method, don't do anything at all unless there are different tips selected. Okay, so this is just, well, it goes away. It's the and this is somewhere in the middle. Generally, I tend to use this, so it's randomly for each, basically. Otherwise, it's going to stay like that, right? Still very inky. Very nice brush. Blend brush tips with darken. You won't see it unless you have the density enabled. So it's going to change just a little bit, not much. But it is going to make a little bit of a difference. You're going to have to experiment given what you like and what you don't. I'm going to remove this because I don't like it. So I'm going to keep that one. In fact, I don't like this either. Let me choose something that's a little better for an inking brush. You know what? This. I don't know who made it. I have no idea. But something like this. I do like this a little better. There you go. And I'll remove the density pressure. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, I like this one. Better inking brush. Pretty cool. Flip horizontal and flip vertical is basically just flipping the image. So that's what it does. Spraying effect is literally spraying particles around. So that's what you get if you are into this sort of thing. I use it for a manga effect, honestly, that I learned from Sin Lair. Check him out, by the way. He's an awesome artist. It's not very useful unless you are going to use a specific method. So this changes depending on the brush size, the size of the particles, or stays the same. So smaller, denser. This is going to change the density, like how many particles there are here. And the deviation is how far away from the beginning. Let's see if I can increase the particle size. How far away from the center, basically, they are. This is very close. And this is very far. See that? A direction, well, it's the same thing as the other direction. Again, very useful for doing stuff like leaves. If I make them deviate more, I can have, leaves like that. They're like beans right now, but pretend they're leaves, and they're leaves floating, right, like that. You can also use it, by the way, by pushing this. I have it set to X, to the keystroke X, so it changes between transparent. It might be C by default, between transparent and opaque brush. So you can also apply the same effect to your erasing. See, you paint negatively, basically, which is pretty cool. Anyway, let me remove that. We talked about everything for brush tip. There is another setting that's kind of important, and that is ribbon. Might seem completely useless. You're just repeating the shape like that. So you can make a decoration. But if you pair it with an image that's actually repeatable, you can make something like this. I made this with that setting. These are chain brushes. Okay, and you can make them look more three-dimensional than this with more settings. If I couple this with the brush size, I can make the chain come towards me. Obviously, this depends on the original image. If the original image does not lend itself to this type of effect, it's going to look like crap. But ideally, it does. This is what you can do. So it is going to bend and create artifacts sometimes, but it's really good as a time saver. This saved me hours, and I'm not kidding. This saved me hours. So depending on how you set up the brush, obviously this is not about creating this tutorial is not about creating this specific brush, but depending on how you set up the original image, it's going to change the front, so the light part or the dark part of the image with these two colors. Okay, so if I do this now, it's gonna look weird. Well, you don't see it because it's completely white. This is gonna be completely black. This is gonna be like the opposite. See, you can change that. This is the pretty realistic chain because I used an actual chain image to make this. So lots of things you can do just by using this ribbon, which is repeating basically pattern. If I don't, that's what it's gonna look like. So crap, chain, pretty cool, right? And you can use this to make a lot of things. I did use this to make a rope type of thing. Okay. Let's disable the ribbon now because we saw that. There are really many things you can do with the brush settings we saw so far. For example, just by repeating a custom shape, if we make something that's more like a scale of a monster, we can do a brush. We can make a brush that's, look at that. It's going to turn whatever we want into a sort of tail. So let's say I have whatever dragon. I always draw a dragon next for some reason. And this is actually looking up or something. Okay. Now we have the neck here. We don't want to draw all the scales, right, manually, because we're lazy. So let's pretend this is a finished ink, even if it's not. I can literally take this brush and maybe changing the color. You can change it to something like that, for example. There you go. Erase this part. Maybe keep that. And just go over with another brush like this. And it's saving time. It's just one stroke basically, right? Then you can paint over that obviously to make it look better. But that's a huge time saver. So keep that in mind. All right, let's move forward. Number 2, brush shape, whatever. This is not very useful, again, for me. You can make a dual brush, basically, adding more stuff to the current brush. So I don't want to edit my triangle brush, though. Let's go back to this. And let me remove the ribbon. So let's go back to this one. Let's turn on density. And go back to this one, right? So dual brush. It's applying a different shape. See how it's changed already? To the original. So it's going to take that second tip and blend that tip with the original. So if I make it softer, you see how that's soft? It's basically like inside of this bean looking thing, there is another brush now. So it's very confusing for me to use. I've never really gotten anything good out of that, but you can probably take something like these random things and see if you can get something decent. It does get slow. You can change the thickness depending on what you want in there. But the best course of action, let's say 2 brush size, can I change that? Yeah, so something like that. See, it starts adding that second brush. Given the first one, I think the first one is a stencil for the second. I don't find it useful. You can probably tell. I'm not a fan of this thing. It's basically the same settings as the other. It's just that you have a secondary shape to mix together. Not a fan. Not a fan, really. So you can basically, I would say, the most interesting use is if you want to add some texture, which we didn't see yet, by the way. It's like your bean, say, there you go. If you make it small enough, you can see the bean and the second one. I don't know. Not a fan. There you go, something like this textured. It's not really a texture, it's a secondary brush. So you can use it by all means. So something like this maybe. But it just feels strange to me. So instead of using the dual brush, what I do is using textures. So when you have some density, sensitivity, you can enable some of these. I like to use this cover weathered. I think this was included in the default brushes. Sorry if it's not, but you can use any texture. You can literally make it the same way we made the brush. You can make the texture. This adds the texture on top of the brush itself. Now, this is an inking brush, so it's not going to look very good with the normal texture mode. But if we use hard mix, already is starting to change. If we use subtract, is going to literally remove opacity based on this texture. So now we get transparency based on the texture that's there. Density is pretty self-explanatory. It's how hard we push on that. So if we increase the density, the texture is going to be flat on the canvas, so it's going to be there, static, wherever it is in the original image. So you see, we're basically painting in the texture. It's like there is a canvas we're painting on. That's a pretty cool effect. But it's limited. It's limited to what's underneath. You can invert it if you want and just paint the negative. So that's going to be interesting. Emphasize density, it kind of makes this sort of notan effect. I don't know how good this is. It basically flattens the original image. Scale ratio, all these things are used to, well, scale the ratio. So you can make that texture smaller and give a different effect. But then it's going to show that it's repeating, right? You can rotate it. I wish we had some randomness here, which you might be able to achieve with the secondary brush shape. I have not used it much, so that's why I'm not covering it in detail. And honestly, I don't think it's particularly useful. The problem with the texture is if you try to erase, it's not going to work. You have to invert the texture if you want that to work. So if you invert the texture, then it works. I wish there was a script or something that did that. So I can paint the original texture. If I erase, see, it doesn't work. If I invert it, it's very faint. You probably have to change the density a little bit. See, it starts erasing on the negative. Okay, so pretty cool to get some interesting effects. You can try all these. Height is another one some people use. Not always working depending on the texture you have. I usually use hard mix or subtract sometimes. Depends. You can also apply it to each plot. This, I've been for a long time under the conviction that this was applying to every single tip. Either it doesn't work. See, it says it gets denser as the overlap. I don't know. This doesn't seem to work for me. Like, it's not, maybe it works only with some brush settings, some texture settings, like overlay settings. But for me, it just never worked. So again, normal, not a good idea. Generally subtract in changing these settings so that the original image changes. It's like changing the levels of the original image, basically. Would work better with a different brush, obviously. But you can get a decent pencil stroke effect with this. Watercolor Edge. Let me actually disable the texture for this. Watercolor Edge is another one of those settings that I wish they worked. But they don't. Because it kind of sucks. It's pretty bad. So I would personally not use it. You can if you want. It's a little better if you use a tip that's actually like a watercolor. There aren't really many good tips, like brush tips, for this sort of effect. Some are better like this, depending on this one. Depending on how thick one edge is, see, it works. But not the greatest. So if you disable that completely, you will see it here. You can also change the thickness of the edge. If you're into this sort of stuff, you can make some interesting effect. I personally don't like that, and if I were to use something similar, I would go here and just turn on a border or an edge for everything. Obviously, this would change a little bit of how it looks, but if you make it, if I clean this up and disable the watercolor edge, see, maybe a different color like that. See, it's very similar, in fact. Very much the same, I would say. It's not good looking. It's not as good as Psy. It's something that tries to make it like Psy, but yeah, it's not the same. So, personal recommendation, nah, don't like very much. You can use it. Some things it can do, I would still not use it, personally. Erase, well, it's what it says. It erases. So this only works if it's set in erasing as a vector eraser on a vector layer. So if you draw a vector line, then you turn on the vector eraser, you can basically erase part of the original, depending on what settings you have. In this case, I think I do have some density opacity. So this is more useful for inking, I guess. See, it's erasing some parts of that. You can choose what to erase. You can erase everything, for example, like that. Vectors work in dots, so like there are micro dots and splines connecting these things here, and you're going to just erase one here. Okay, that's what it does. So if you have like an eraser brush, that's what it does. That's literally the same vector eraser that's there in the menu. I would just use the vector eraser as it is, personally. So correction is, well, if you're lazy, you can basically change some of these. You can probably see if I zoom in. Change some of these. See, it's sharpening some corners. Not a fan. Stabilization is actually pretty good on the other hand. It helps a lot in making lines look a little smoother, but you gotta have to go fast. So it also changes depending on how fast you go if you check that setting. Pretty useful. I do use it for inking a little bit. Generally I tend to use like 15 if I enter ink something. It is very, very useful to have it compared to nothing. Look at how wiggly it is. Normally you would not see this on paper if you were to ink on paper because you have resistance from the paper between the tip. Whether a brush, maybe not, but still there is some kind of friction. It's a little more stable. On glass, that's basically what we paint on. It's not there. So we need some degree of stabilization, which is also why I said when you do those circle exercises, do them on paper because you always have this sort of digital software correction going on otherwise. A stabilization mode, this corrects it later. This corrects it on the go. I tend to use it on the go because it's better. Post-correction tends to, well, I would say straighten the line if it's not straight. It's not perfect. It's not as good as the one from Procreate. It works somehow, but if you want a straight line, just use a straight line tool because it's probably better. There's no shift click in Clip Studio versus Photoshop. So you can check all these settings. They don't do as much. I was a fan of post-correction until I got tired of it because I would rather just, you use an actual ruler maybe on the screen. It's probably a little better. So tapering, I've not seen a specific effect from this, quite honestly. Now, it also happens that sometimes when you keep fiddling with the brush a lot, it's just going to be screwed up. So keep copies of your brushes and save them often because you will screw them up. I've done that and I've lost brushes that I had made with care because I did not save them. So this one is now screwed up a little bit because it's doing some weird stuff. Like here at the tip. I'm not sure why. But when that happens, you basically have to reset the brush and do it again. So save them. When you get to a point where you're extremely happy with your brush, save it. Okay? Do. Ending and starting, there are some settings you can check here depending on what you have enabled there. It's going to change as a post-process effect the thickness, basically. In this case, because brush size, you can use also density if it's enabled. Oh, it is actually here. Okay, it does enable them in any case. See, I don't use it very often. It's a post-process effect. If you like it, use it. It's very digital though. In my personal opinion, it's better to get as close as possible to real media than to use digital stuff, unless it's useful like the chain stuff and the repeating stuff. That is extremely useful if you have to make maps or a lot of chains. Because drawing chains, man, I've drawn chains a lot. And I had to draw like the links one by one. So that was not fun. That was really not fun. Not for me. So this is something you might want to consider. Ending and beginning is basically what it says. So it applies to one side or the other. Anti-overflow allows you to paint inside a reference layer that you can set like so. So you can see if I go there, this is the reference layer. So if I paint another layer, obviously, it's not going to overflow. See, I should be painting outside. If I cross with the middle, it does. Otherwise, it doesn't. It keeps the initial, I would say the vector, the inner vector of the stroke as your border. So very easy to fill something. If I empty that and I make a larger brush, see, it's staying inside. As long as the middle of your tip or the exact point of contact of your pen is inside or outside, for what it matters, so you can do the same thing, like that. It's going to stay inside. This is extremely useful, and hopefully you saw it in a short that I made some time ago. A fill up to vector path is exactly that. Otherwise, it leaves a small, you probably cannot see it here because it's not transparent. It leaves a small gap. You cannot see it here because it's a pretty dark stroke, but it does leave a bit of a white gap there that you do not want. So fill up to vector path is going to fill until basically the middle of the stroke. Area scaling also does a similar thing. So you see, that's more visible. That's not nice. Always keep area scaling on. All right. And that's pretty much it. That's how you deal with all the brush settings in Clip Studio. Again, to recap, if I have to recommend anything, this one is the tab that is the most important for me, together with the texture, I would say. So do check out these panels on your own. Make sure you understand what everything does. And this is going to be better at random, yeah. And then make your own brushes. If you don't want to spend too much time doing that, you just want to grab some brushes, you will find them once more in the video description at my Gumroad. Otherwise, really, give it a go. You don't need to buy brushes. You don't need to get brushes from someone else. Make your own. That's what I've done. I did check some other brushes out to understand how they were done. But now you got this guide, so hopefully it's enough for you to understand how these settings work. Please do give it a go. Make at least one brush that's really tailored to your needs, and then maybe get others and learn how to use them, okay? That's all I have for you for today. I hope you find this video useful. If you did, smash that like button and subscribe because more are to come. As always, thanks for watching and take care.